Hello and welcome to what I could really only think to call the Vibes Check video at the 2-month mark of N5. It's February 2025 at time of recording, which means we've had the edition for about 2 months now, since mid-December, which is kind of enough time to play a bunch of games, get your head around some of the thornier rules changes, really bed in how the new edition is feeling. And so that's what this video is about, how I'm feeling about the new edition now that I've had enough time to actually really familiarize myself with it. And so, in this video, we'll be talking about what people in generally, but me in specific, seem to think about N5 so far. This is an initial impressions video with the note that 2 months is enough time to have played quite a lot of games, actually getting a pretty good feel for the good and bad of the new edition. And so we'll talk through that and then break some of those things down, because a few of them I think are actually really quite interesting. We're then, since Jordan isn't here to stop me, going to talk about how I think armies are doing compared to how we thought they were going to do in our initial impressions video. If you haven't seen it, there is a deranged 2 days after launch hot takes video where we tier list, because of course we do, every single faction in the game. So it's been 2 months, and I've played with many of those factions. Let's take a look at how I think those rankings were and where I think some factions should be moved to. We're then going to close out just very briefly with what I'm kind of looking forward to over the next year in Infinity. Now, in case it wasn't absolutely clear, this is a vibes check video. This is not a serious state of the game style thing, because I can't speak for everyone. Although I have absolutely played some games on TTS, I've talked to many different friends throughout the community, and I've kept my eye on even some of the sillier posts that are being made in things like the Discord and the Infinity Global Community Facebook page. This is just how I'm feeling, and how I'm feeling mostly is pretty good. So what's the good and the bad of the edition so far? I think the good definitely outweighs the bad, actually pretty considerably. Just locally, the community is doing well. We're running events. I've already run one small event myself. We've got local games nights happening. It's a pretty good vibe check. There have been people coming back into the community, people who it is great to see after some time absent, and they all seem to be having a pretty good time with the new edition as well. Kind of interestingly, I would also note, and other people have observed this as well, that N5 games are tending toward being live for longer. It was not uncommon in N4 and in N3 before that a really decisive alpha strike could end the game kind of early. If not on turn 1, then kind of on turn 2 when you couldn't recover from the damage. And a lot of my material historically has been about managing that risk and making sure you don't get caught in that situation. And even in games where experienced players are playing against returning players, in N5, I have noticed that the game tends to be more live for longer. Now, I have a few thoughts about that we'll cover in a future slide, but that's a really cool, just like little development. I don't know if it was planned for or it's a design goal from the development team, but it is something that I have observed, with like one notable exception, which is a battle report you can find on this channel featuring Norkias, and it's a pretty good overall trend. I'd also note that the game's overall balance actually has seriously impressed me, especially internally in most factions across profiles in different points brackets. That's something else that we'll talk about in some depth a bit further in this video, but that's something that Infinity has like almost never had before. Not really, not real value, not real balance between the values of especially wildly varying troops at different points brackets. And that's something that's a really big deal and has produced itself some really interesting and positive externalities around things like list construction. In terms of niggling issues that I have with the edition, I would say it's not perfect. It's very good. It's some of the best Infinity has ever been, but especially some of the more experimental rules I think that were included in N5, I don't know if they've landed as well as CB hoped. Turrets, I think they could use some tweaking. Speedball definitely needs some attention, and frankly, the Bang Bomb rule can just be quietly deleted so that we don't waste that mental space on it, because it kind of may as well not exist. These are pretty minor complaints, although we will talk about turrets and Speedball, but they are kind of a sign that, yep, there are still some things that could use some tweaking with the addition. I'm not going to talk about it at length in this video, but I'd also note that the balance around hacking and guided missiles seems mostly to be pretty good. I'm very mixed on the range bands on pitches and the effects that has had on different troops. There's some real winners and losers around that specific change. But the balance of how InfoWar works generally seems pretty solid, and I have absolutely had some experiences that kind of showcase my expectation that guided missiles will remain a thing that's in the game, but they will more and more be pushed to a tool that you use when you have to, rather than necessarily a first order strategy that's how you begin a game. And that feels like pretty much the right spot for those rules. InfoWar generally will probably still be very important. Guided will be useful, but maybe not as much a build around. But that is something that we will have to continue to watch over time, because that stuff's pretty deep meta. Like, how useful guided is something that only really becomes super apparent once more of the meta has shaken out with more certainty, and we actually really kind of know what we expect to have to deal with and resolve in terms of challenges in each individual game. By the end of N4, you could pretty clearly estimate what the kind of tools you would need, or what kind of defensive tools your opponents would have to deal with, you would have to deal with over the course of a game, and Guided was a good fit for dealing with them. Guided, I don't think, is as good a fit for dealing with many of the defensive tools in N5, because some of those tools are things like turrets, and if you spend time trying to guided fire a turret, you are going to have a bad time in the game overall. So I'm not going to talk about guided anymore, other than that I think they're in a pretty good space on balance around that one. It's neither a good nor a bad. I think it's mostly fine. Pitches I'm a bit mixed on, but the general balance of InfoWar feels good. I'd also note that ITS 16 Part 2 gets a resounding, it's fine from me. I think that season Part 2 of ITS 16 would have really benefited from being a bit more foundational. I think it would really have benefited from being an addition that new players and returning players could grapple with more easily. Instead, we still have things like QAZ zones and QAZ creatures. And while my assumption is that the designers didn't really want to actually change too much on that front while they were changing everything else about the game, if you think about the audience in terms of who would most benefit from changes to ITS, I don't know if keeping all of those extras in for the season between now and when it rolls over in October this year was exactly the right idea. These are just kind of minor niggling things, though. Overall, the edition feels like it's in really kind of a good place, and especially the way that the games are going longer and how internal balance is working inside factions are very nice positive points that we'll talk about. So the first interesting good thing I am finding about N4 that is not obvious and explicit just from the release of the game and looking through profiles and everything is that games tend to be going to turn 3 more often. And my working theory for that is that it's actually in large part down to the changes to the baggage rule. Now, yes, baggage lets you reload turrets, but turrets are kind of a second order part of the fact that free reloads incentivize players to throw out material as part of their game plan, right? By material, I mean things like pitches and, yes, turrets and mines and perimeter weapons, etc. All of those pieces of equipment are a little bit more attractive when the game sits there going, well, you can reload for free. It's free. It's value. So take your pitches, your deployable repeaters, your fast pandas, all of your perimeter weapons, mines, etc., turrets, yes. Take those and use them, and that will be used offensively but also defensively, right? Creating and buying space, knowing that you'll be able to then get those. You won't have to spend an entire order to reload. You'll be able to reload for free in the states phase and do it again the next turn. And that creates a rhythm of play that is really interesting. Most of the time, players will not want to place deployable, reload, place deployable. That's fairly order inefficient for all of the reasons that baggage was order inefficient in prior editions. But if your plan is to use the free states phase baggage reload, well then you'll spend 1 or 2 orders on 1 or 2 troopers firing their mine dispensers, placing their turrets, firing out pitchers, etc. And that's 1 or 2 orders from your turn. And then your opponent will often have to spend 2 or 3 orders on their turn clearing the material, the equipment that you've deployed. It's pretty uncommon to completely easily clear a turret in a single order. Dealing with things like pitches and mines is also a little bit order intense some of the time. But what it means is that both players are spending orders to create and then clear space. The first player in this example is spending 1 or 2 orders to place deployable equipment. The second player is then spending 2 or 3 orders to clear deployable equipment, which means that in total, across 2-player turns, 4 or 5 orders are being spent not killing each other. And that just inherently delays the game's rush towards resolution. And this is compounded in a good way by the fact that the defensive equilibrium in N5 is actually just more defensively favored than I'd thought. Even with the fact that there's only a single deployable turret mine layer in the game, they've just added a bunch of cool defensive tech to most factions. There are mine layer 2 profiles in quite a few factions now. The Thunderbolt Total Reaction Bot is accessible to almost every faction in the game, and the factions that don't have, like Ariadnan factions that don't have those, did get things like the Vistral, which is a little bit more expensive, but its own interesting kind of defensive pace. Even factions like US Ariadna, for example, which is probably not a particularly strong faction in N5, just picked up a Foxtrot mine layer, which was something that was missing from it for literally its entire existence so far. The fact that US Ariadna now can lay a little bit of a minefield actually quite cheaply gives it some more defensive depth that it didn't have. And so between every faction having this little bit of additional defensive depth that makes resisting turn 1 alpha strikes more easy, and all players across every faction at least having the attractive option to play a bit more of a material-based game that has both players spending orders, deploying equipment, and then clearing that deployed equipment, we can see, I have noticed with only like literally one exception, game states where the game just, everyone's got a little bit more in the way of resources heading into turn 2 and heading into turn 3, which means that the game is just more live, even playing games against returning players that I would nominally expect to, and do have something of a skill advantage over, there's still like lines of play that both players can pursue all the way through to turn 3 in like almost all of the scenarios. And that is just super cool. Like I am really, really here for that. I absolutely cannot speak with any accuracy to how intentional a design decision was. It wasn't spoken about at all in like any of the seminars or anything before the edition dropped, but it's something that I have observed, and I think it's a really good overall meta change, especially if it persists. And I have no reason to think that it won't persist because those tools that are making this a thing are just attractive and available across a lot of factions. So that's cool thing number 1 about Infinity N5, and it's a really nice thing to see in the game. The second cool thing about N5 that I frankly did not expect to be a thing ahead of the edition is that the game balance is really good. Now, let me caveat that a little bit, because that sounds like a really damning kind of statement, but it's important to recognize that Infinity, particularly over N3 and N4, traded very heavily in terms of balance on the underlying mechanics of the game. In N5, so in N4 and N3, even in N5, there is no profile that is a substitute for good play. Because of how face-to-face rolls and modifiers and the general lethality of the game has always worked, there is no situation in which a poorly played and unlucky, or just poorly played, powerful troop is better than a well-played, well-maneuvered troop brought to bear in the right place in the right time. It is absolutely true, and it has been true across every edition, that a model with a combi rifle in the right place at the right time can kill the most expensive tag in the game. Now, I wouldn't want to be the person using a Fusilier to try and kill an avatar, but if you get it out of cover and you're in good range and you're in cover and you're shooting it in the back and you like etc., right? These things are possible. It's not a mathematical impossibility or even a colossal mathematical improbability that the right trooper in the right place in the right time outperforms relative to its points cost. And what this has meant is that for most of Infinity's history, the game designers have been able to be a little fast and loose in terms of the internal balance between profiles. A really good example of this, especially if we go all the way back to N3, but even in N4, if you took some of the cheapest warband and order-generating troops in the game, and you just took an equal weight of them against some of the more expensive troops in the game, the value proposition was not remotely close. In N3 and even in N4, 80 points for a tag would not be unreasonable. For those 80 points, I could theoretically get 16 5-point troopers, some of which are regular, some of which are fairly dangerous stealth warbands. So like Quan Xi and Shaolin monks, for example. I can get 4 of each of those for 40 points plus the cost of a Celestial Guard controller. That is half the cost plus the Celestial Guard, so not much more than half the cost of a tag. And the effect of those troops wildly outperforms the 80-point tag. It especially did so in N3. Even in N4, yes, the cheap models were just much more valuable for their points cost. And that was true kind of in a graduating way all the way up the spectrum. N4 kind of achieved balance around those things by introducing effectively a third currency. In addition to points and SWC, you now had troop slots. And so N4 balanced itself heavily around the fact that you only had 15 troops, so it was not physically possible to take all of those spammy warband pieces, etc. A Warcore was not the best model in the game in N4 because it occupied one of your very valuable troop slots. Even if it represented 1% of your force at 3 points, it represented a significantly larger percentage of your available troops. Therefore, it was consuming a resource as list construction. Therefore, the Warcore in N4 was a sometimes taken. And so there was game balance in that way in N4, but if you still compared in absolute terms a 5-point model to an 80-point model, the 80-point model was absolutely not 16 times better than the 5-point model. In N5, it feels closer than it has ever been. And even if we set aside the more extreme ends of the spectrum, right? 100-point models versus 5-point models, across all of the middle bands, troopers that cost 15 points, 18 points, 23 points, 30 points, 36 points, all of those feel much, much more worth their points cost than has ever really been the case. You can go to maybe not every single faction, but a lot of factions, and just pick out troopers along those different points bands and compare them, and just kind of find that, yeah, the 22-point models feel like they're worth about 22 points, and the 30-point models feel like they're worth about 30 points, and the 50-point models feel like they're worth about 50 points. This is especially true with troopers that used to have very expensive rules, so things like hidden deployment and combat jump. Those no longer feel like outliers, where that rule has to pay off or the model is bad. I am seeing lots of models with combat jump where you might not use that rule. You might just deploy them normally because that's the better use of that particular trooper, because they have things like super jump, jet propulsion, or just they're a good model to have. I am actually seriously considering a couple of lists where some of the time I will elect to just not deploy, not even my camouflage, right? Non-camouflage, hidden deployment Hassassin models. I will be like, no, I don't need to deploy that model as a hidden deployment. Actually, I want the extra order, and if you took a Hassassin Shujay profile and you just stripped hidden deployment off of it, it would still probably be worth the points cost, because it is an EM Mine Layer 2 specialist operative with decent stats. And so this just like broad good game balance, even if from a personal perspective it has come at the loss of some of my like personal favorite pet profiles. A lot of the models in Infinity that I have loved the most over N3 and N4 were cheap models that outperformed. I love cheap models that outperform because they're really good. I love them in every game that I play. But yes, those models have kind of across the board been brought back down to earth to a greater or lesser extent. Some of them lesser extent, things like Shaolin monks, still very, very good in close combat, but it's a little harder for them to throw smoke grenades, and the top end of Yu Qing is kind of all been buffed or had its points cost reduced. Things like McCalls in Toha, they're still a good profile, but they no longer get the fire team benefits that they did not having their impetuous suppressed. so they're much more fair for 14 points. But then, at the top end, looking at factions like Yuqing, for example, you have all of these profiles that are like, that's just good for those points costs. Things like Yanhuos and Moangs and all of the hacker models with pictures, etc. There's just all of this good stuff, nothing which seems egregious, but so much stuff seems good across a multitude of points cost. And that has produced an environment where list diversity feels genuinely better than it has ever been. Now, some of this, it must be said, is a product of the fact that we're all still kind of learning the edition. 2 months is enough time to have played plenty of games, but it's not enough time to truly develop this is now a solved state kind of game, even if I'm not necessarily of the opinion that the game ever reaches a truly solved state. But you might argue that we are still in not exactly a honeymoon period, but a novelty period, where we haven't all been able to play with all of these fact profiles and been able to say, you know what, I actually think I've played 3 games with a Assassin AR now, and I do like it, or I don't like it. I will now include it or exclude it from lists. We aren't in that kind of solved state position yet, even if people have played. There are some people who have played a lot of games, but most of us will still be in that novelty period. But even if I look back to N4, for example, where there was the same novelty period early in the edition, this diversity wasn't present there. Most factions feel like they can be built in multiple different directions, and I have been genuinely surprised and impressed just going into a faction and being like, yeah, I'm going to build this for a little while and see what I can come up with. And there will be 2 or 3 different directions, wildly different directions in some cases, that the faction could be taken in because of the internal balance between the profiles. And that's, 1, unexpected, 2, borderline unprecedented across the history of Infinity, and 3, really, really cool. It's one of the best things about the edition. And while I do expect there are people who probably disagree with me on this take, people who have stronger opinions about that kind of thing, it is a personal observation that I've personally made, and it's really promising. I expected Infinity's overall game balance to be good because the core resolution mechanics and way of playing the game makes it very tolerant of imbalances at the profile level. But the fact that we actually have quite good balance at the profile level has just produced some really fun list building experiences. Now, I did mention that there were some bad things, some niggling things about the edition as well, and it wouldn't really be reasonable to just mention the stuff that I like without at least paying some attention to the couple of things that I think probably still need a little bit of work. And really, I'm grouping these together as one and only one bad thing. There are a couple of mechanics that I don't think fully landed, and I don't know if they have had exactly the effect that the designers hoped for. Now, as a caveat, I generally avoid wishlisting specific mechanical changes. I don't think it's particularly productive or useful or conducive to happiness to say this specific change should be made to the game, because I don't have any control over that. And as a very wise person once said, the root of all suffering is desire, and so the desire for specific rules changes is really only going to cause yourself suffering. But I do have a few thoughts, in particular about Speedball and Armed Turrets, 2 of the most conspicuous additions to N5. Speedball has somehow managed to be both less impactful and less positively received than I'd expected. I have not really seen anyone have much particularly good to say about Speedball. The closest is I have seen, and I have had people tell me about, kind of cool games, specifically where jetpacks were involved and models getting jetpacks from Speedball. Those are just anecdotal. What I haven't heard are anecdotes about Speedball actually breaking open the game and enabling an Alpha Strike that otherwise wouldn't have. That doesn't change the fact that the most common impact of Speedball is likely to be as an offensive enabler, in particular on the first turn. And I think Switch On especially, but also to an extent Vitapack and Auto Medkit, are the not necessarily extant right now, but they are the potential problem children. And I think they are going to be the most significant problem children of this rule as people get better and better at attacking into the defensive tools that are accessible to people in N5. Now, I'm kind of the opinion that I don't know if Speedball actually needs to be in the game overall, but it's not going to be removed. It's obviously a pet mechanic of some of the designers. They're very enthusiastic for the idea, and had I personally played as much Helldivers as they probably have, I would probably be enthusiastic for it as well. But as it is currently written and therefore played, it's mostly a turn one mechanic that enables offensive potential to push through defensive tools. And that is something that isn't necessarily great to have in the game kind of generally, and also isn't, say, the design goal of the mechanic, which was as a tool that would help break stalemates. And tools that help break stalemates are a good idea. Particularly in an edition where the defensive equilibrium seems to rest a little more toward the defensive than maybe it has previously, you want to make sure that the game doesn't get bogged down in defensive stalemates, where one player can't push past the defenses of the other. And boy howdy, do we have an example about that coming up. And while there are tools added to the game, particularly things like the disco ball, for example, that enable you to push past and play around entrenched defenses, Switch On just exists primarily as a tool that enables turn one offense. And turn one offense is not really what we need to be worried about in terms of things that need to be powerful in Infinity. So I am kind of leaning towards, and I think I've seen, this is probably one of the most common changes that I've seen suggested around Speedball. I lean toward it being a mechanic that becomes accessible from turn 2 onwards. I think if you do that, then it has more potential to be that tool that enables recovery of a dangerous game state. So if you are a player who is in a position where you are behind because of something that has occurred, something has been rendered unconscious, something has been rendered isolated or immobilized, you need to push past a dangerous defense, you're out of equipment and you need to reload, these are the turn 2 situations that Speedball would become more useful. Now, I think it's kind of possible that as I play more with Speedball, I might shift toward using it more as a turn 2 mechanic anyway. But on the other hand, just being able to call down a switch on and break through any hacking or EM-based defense that is presented to me, or at least having one chance to do that with my most powerful offensive tool, like a model like Norcaius, kind of just seems like also potentially the most optimal way to continue to use the mechanic. So overall, I would say Speedball is not, it's not a failure of a mechanic, but it's not yet a success. I think it needs a little bit of adjustment. I think it needs a little bit of development attention, and I think the community have kind of highlighted the ways in which it is potentially a problem. The second mechanic that I'm just kind of keeping an eye on is armed turrets. Now, let me preface this with, I love armed turrets. I think they're one of my favorite additions to the edition. I think they're thematically awesome. They're something that I've wanted to exist in the game for a really long time. And in 90% of games that I have seen them played in, they're powerful, but they're not overpowered. But there is that little 10% delta. And even in that 10% delta, I don't think it's armed turrets themselves that are overpowered, but there's this idea of defensive debt, where specifically you can have the problem where you have a player who is doing well, and they are able to launch an offense, they make an attack, that attack does some damage, and as part of their turn, they place some armed turrets. Those turrets are now permanent features on the game table until they are destroyed. So, their opponent has to spend some orders to clear those turrets. But what if they can't? What if maybe they get unlucky fighting them? That can happen. Armed turrets are not great gunfighters, but they can still win face-to-face rolls. Or more likely, they're just a little bit pinned back. They're dealing with the offensive elements that their opponent pushed into their deployment zone. They just have to buy themselves some space on their own side of the table, and so they don't deal with the turrets. And so the requirement to deal with those turrets to progress into the parts of the field that they are covering still exists, but then on the next turn, the first player places some more turrets because they've reloaded with baggage. So now there are 4 armed turrets on the battlefield. And the second player begins their turn and they have to start fighting these and they have to deal with a couple of them, but maybe they can only deal with 1 or 2 because there are still other things that are going on the game table and they're still recovering their own sort of situation. And then the first player places some more turrets and they reload and then they place some more because they have the space to do so. And now there are maybe 5 turrets on the field that the second player has to deal with and which they haven't been able to deal with on their first turn and second turn. And so that mass of defensive material has run away from them, and the defensive debt has built up to a point that it's too large to overcome. Now, this doesn't happen in many games, but it does happen a little bit. I have seen it happen, and I've heard about it happen anecdotally in some really good Kestrel lists that are built around actually being quite proactive, first with the mine layers, but second using NCO orders on Fireflies as part of small fire teams to pull back offensive pieces that have attacked, and while pulling back, also place some turrets down. And when you couple mine layer on the turrets, plus first turn, plus placing a couple of more turrets, so we have that point have 4 before the second player goes into their first turn, plus all of the attacking that the Kestrel player has done, you can genuinely have situations where the defensive debt presented by the turrets is just really difficult to overcome and begins to be a critical mass. Now, I have also seen at least one example on the Infinity Global community where 2 players went into the game intending to build lists that could throw as many turrets out as possible and spent the entire game doing nothing but throwing turrets. And I have kind of discounted that as an example, because that is an example of 2 people saying, we are intentionally going to make the most unfun experience possible, and it will shock you to learn that this experience was unfun. Like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, that sounds like a terrible way to play the game. Nobody is doing that, don't do that. But if we wind that back from a deeply impractical example to a practical example, the extremes of the practical example can still be some kind of unfun game experiences at that very edge of the experience. Now, in terms of changing this, I'm not sure how. I have written down, it would actually be nice to see a few more mine layers with armed turrets, but only very judiciously, right? On profiles that are carefully chosen, things that are not themselves cheap. Don't put mine layer armed turret on any like 15-point engineer, but stuff like Kurgat engineers in Morats and Govad engineers in Assassins, those kind of like 27 plus point profiles that you aren't necessarily taking terribly often. A couple of mine layer turret options as a little bit of a like, hey, take this very expensive profile, give it a shot, here's your treat if you do that, I think could be kind of cool to see. But regardless of whether that becomes a thing in the game, I do think it could be well worth considering whether or not there should be a limit on just how many turrets can actually be in play. Now, again, I would generally avoid wishlisting specific or mechanical changes, but having rolled this around in my head a little bit, if I was to try and implement this myself, it would be something like, say, a bandwidth rule. Maybe you could call the rule that, with the intention of the effect being that a model with an armed turret can have 1 armed turret in play at a time. So your Firefly armed turret mine layer profile can have their 1 armed turret marksman rifle in play, and if they place a new one before the old one is destroyed, remove the old one from play. In effect, you can only control per model with an armed turret, you can only control 1 armed turret at a time. That means that armies that have 2 models with armed turrets can have 2 armed turrets in play, and if the opposing player destroys them, or you place new ones, okay, cool, yep, you get your new ones, the old ones are removed, so maybe you can do things like walk turrets forward, you can take new space, but the idea, the problem that I can kind of see around turrets is that the defensive debt builds up to a point where it can't be overcome. You avoid that if you have a limit on how many turrets can be in play. Now, there are other ways that you could do this. For example, you could make turrets not reloadable, strictly single use, not disposable, stuff like that. I think that's getting a little bit more off kilter. And I would like to preserve the core of the experience because I'm actually really enjoying playing with them. I do think that in like 80 to 90% of games, they're a really cool addition to the game. I like using them. I don't find them particularly overpowered. Sometimes they're not even especially strong. I need to get better at using them. I've been using things like Monstruckers with their AP rifle turrets, for example, and you really do feel the 16-inch range band limitations on those. Marksman turrets are a little bit easier to use, obviously, etc., etc. But the overall experience I wanted to keep in the game, I think there just needs to be a little bit of attention paid to the extreme edge of the turret experience, where a critical mass of them gets built up and can just no longer be cleared with the resources a player has in a single turn. Some attention to that specific problem, and I think they're awesome, basically close to perfect. They're one of my favorite additions to N5. Now, With a lot of praise and a little bit of critique rendered at the new edition, let's jump into how different armies are doing. So, as I mentioned, and as you will recall, my good friend Jordan and I did a very lengthy video going through every faction in the game on release of N5. That was our collective opinions, we would argue back and forth, and with the full acknowledgement that that was a deranged hot take, completely unrepresentative of how the game would actually shake out, we put every single faction in the game on a tier list between S and C and D and lower. I have since, obviously, had a chance to play as or against a lot of those factions, and so I have some opinions on how some factions are absolutely doing better or worse than I thought. Let's start with the factions that are doing better than I thought. And the first of those is Vanilla Yuching. We rated Vanilla Yuching like a mid to high B. I have had a ton of fun with this faction. Like, it has just been a joy to build lists and play, and I have in particular noticed that the complete removal, like Quang Shi are still present in Vanilla Yuching, but the effective complete removal of them from any of my lists because heavy infantry are cheap enough now, good heavy infantry are cheap enough, and there are enough kind of like cheap-ish deployment kind of pieces, things like the Gudan and Libertos are still in the faction, etc., that I can build a list that has 15 troops and does many good and interesting things without a single Quang Shi, which has pushed Yuching into one of my favorite list archetypes, which is the list where almost every trooper does something. Very few cheerleaders, lots of active pieces, a couple of interesting duos, and a ton of capability. They have just been performing really nicely. In terms of raw power, I don't know if they push up ahead some of the strongest A tier factions, but I feel like Yuching for me have absolutely be sitting comfortably in the A faction. They're nice to list build for, they're clean to play, they feel strong, they feel like they have multiple outs, good visibility control, solid hacking, which is one of the things that I really look for in a faction in this edition. Just fun faction to play. I think they've moved from B in my appraisal up to a fairly comfortable mid to low A. In the same vein, and for many of the same reasons, Invincibles. We rated them a mid to low C. They are absolutely better than that. And I think to his credit, Jordan kind of made this case, and I may have overruled him. Now, I have seen quite a lot of Invincible lists that can basically just be described as that's just a vanilla Yuching list with like a small link and the serial numbers filed off. But, like I just mentioned, Vanilla Yuching is awesome. And so even if personally I would say that Invincibles are I enjoy Invincible list construction less than Vanilla Yuching list construction. It's still very slightly more awkward. It doesn't have Shaolin monks, for example. You can just absolutely build Invincible lists that are fully functional and not entirely contingent on the big power link. And you can build Invincible lists that have the big power link. And this is one of the things I was talking about when I said that there are just a bunch of factions in N5 that, thanks to that improved internal balance between profiles of different points costs, just build in different ways, and Invincibles are a really good example of that. Invincibles in N4 used to have to take a big power link in the hopes of punching your opponent out. Like, yes, there were other ways to play them, but you were fighting against the faction's strengths. You're not doing that anymore because there are things like Zensha with Mind Layer 2 and Zensha with cool hacking profiles, and Yanpo are awesome, and you can throw a nice link in as a treat. Maybe it's got some Zhanshi and a Hideout or two in it. And this all just works, even if, for me, I think I could take the same list and build it in Vanilla Yuching in a way that suits me slightly more. I can't deny that the power and flexibility is there, and especially the flexibility was very much missing from Invincibles in N4, and it was some of the inertia of that opinion that led us to, or led me to rank them low in our tier list, unfairly. They should definitely be a B+ or an A- faction. Next up, yes, Kwapu Kalki. Now, this is not the first time I've mentioned this in any video on N5. I was a critic of this faction over most of the previous editions in the game. And I think quite reasonably, Kwapu Kalki was not a particularly good faction in N3 or N4. However, it's not N3 or N4 anymore. It's N5. And a lot of things in QK just kind of function. a little better now. Now, I think it is absolutely still possible to play QK badly. I have seen, just for whatever reason, maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome or some kind of mental equivalent, I have seen plenty of QK players propose lists that are like, you could be so much better than this. What are you doing? What is this list? Why are you doing these things? Like, I have seen, unironically, before they made adjustments to the tag link, you could build a core link in QK of tags that got link bonuses, and I would still see people propose lists that were like, hey, what if I took one of every tag? You could have a special die on that. Now, you can't anymore. They've changed that. But the general list construction exercise with QK now presents lots of solid options. I personally favor pieces like the Azrael, but even if we look at the Azrael, for example, right, one of the more interesting Haris teams, like self-contained teams in QK, is an Azrael, a Burkut shotgun +1 burst. I am really enjoying +1 burst shotguns this edition, by the way, particularly on good heavy infantry, and a Sekban Doctor. That link gets +1 special die bonuses because the Sekban and the Burkut count as the same regiment purposes of the fire team. And it moves up the board really nicely. It has an NCO order. The Sekban is perilously dangerous at close range, but even if you find yourself having to put that link in the midfield, that Azrael is actually really good as a unit to brawl in the midfield now, because Azrael profiles picked up chain rifles, and Azrael have just all of those skills that make every gun they have dangerous, whether it's the Feuerbach, who has +1 burst on every gun, which means that their heavy pistol is effectively burst 4, for example, or even just the cheaper 37-point Pinch Me, I'm Dreaming, What a Steal HMG profile. Like, you just have all of this stuff in QK. And you have Yan Yans, who are 22cc and no special rules is not the best in the game, but they have jet propulsion. What do you want? Like, it's a really fast warband that moves very flexibly and has smoke on 14s. And they have serviceable tags, and they have multiple other link options, and it's very easy to link. And they have a deployment zone parachutist. Not a bad one, and they have the cheapest deployment zone parachutist in the game. I think QK there are some things that hold them back. The info war is at best serviceable. It's present. It relies heavily on Druze, in point of fact. Druze, ballistic skill 12, X-Visor linked pitches, a Druze duo of killer hackers is how you get network projection and KHDs in QK. But hey, you can do that. It's not exactly affordable. QK is still a faction of maybe slightly too expensive medium infantry, but the potential is all there. They are absolutely not a C tier faction. They are at least a B- or a B faction. There is plenty there for them to play with, and again, there are multiple ways to build them as a faction, which is really cool to see, and again, they were treated unfairly in the tier list. Next up is the Hassassin Baram. Now, by the by, that's an awful lot of Yuqing and Hack-Islam factions. Yes, that's what I have been playing mostly, so my opinions on them are going to be the strongest. I have not played, for example, a lot of O12, so I don't have a clear opinion yet on how O12 should move. Just deal with it, these are my thoughts at this stage. But Hassassin Baram has been a faction that has also, we ranked as a B, but they have felt really solid, specifically in that we have multiple different ways to build, and many of them are fearsome. Hassassin for days, I think, are probably the least powerful they have ever been, but they're also cheap. They're 23 points a piece. There is a limit to how much you can expect from a model that is that cost. I do think impersonators are the fairest they have ever been in any edition of Infinity, but that is by no means a bad thing, and it does not cripple Hassassin Baram. I have had multiple games that can best be described as, sir, a second Asawira has entered the deployment zone, and just other things that just have worked very, very nicely. The different links are working functionally. The fire support feels more varied than it has ever been, even though I am still using Asawira, I'm using other things as well. There's a lot going on in Hassassins that has been really enjoyable, and they still have that great defensive mix, including things like the fantastic Shujay profiles. I don't know if they edge all the way up into a full middle of A faction, but they might, and they're certainly at least an A-. And then finally, Rama Task Force, who is another faction that I think we rated low. We rated it about a C. They are at least a B tier faction. Now, Rama Task Force do still have a little bit of that how do you defend? How do you get yourself a first turn faction problem? Their midfield does exist in N5, but it's a little bit awkward. But I think they are a major beneficiary of that accessible ability to buy yourself a first turn with cheap tools like Thunderbolt Turtle reaction pieces. And so, were I playing Rama Task Force, and I think you'll find this reflected if you go and look at things like CanCon lists, there was at least one good performing Rama Task Force player, Ryan Kirby. And although I'm not certain about this, from memory, I believe one or both of his lists ran double Monstrucker, double Shehab Turtle Reaction Bot. Now, that is, yes, that is 4 troops, but none of them are particularly expensive. They comfortably buy you something of a first turn. You can reconstitute those pieces easily, and the Monstruckers are a great profile to let you do things like throw out armed turrets with AP rifles. You can then dedicate the bulk of the rest of your force to doing whatever it is you want out of Rama Task Force, and the active options are pretty cool. Carmen Johns is in the faction, and she's still a very solid biker. You have an impressive mix of link teams, including just Zayadin duoed with a Gulam is a very good gun for relatively fair points cost if you need it. And if you take full advantage of their long range options, you can then even do things like use the Haytham Aero unit, as this is a second biker. Admittedly, I am paying a lot of points for it. I know that Ryan ran a very dangerous and cleverly piloted Quarij team. I believe it was a 4 Quarij team, including Tariq Mansouri and a Beast Hunter. He would just leave the Beast Hunter behind in the deployment zone and then come back to it later in the turn so it could rejoin during the states phase while that Quarij team did all of the work. But they just feel like there are a bunch of ways to play Rama Task Force. You do still have to grapple with the how do I get myself a first turn, but if you can do that, the faction has the tools to perform at least the B level, possibly higher. They're certainly not a C tier. Now, on the flip side of that, what factions are a little bit weaker than I thought? There are a few, starting with Vanilla Haqqislam. This one does not do my heart good. I love Vanilla Haqqislam. I have loved it for 2 editions prior to this one, but help me, I cannot make it work to my satisfaction. Vanilla Haqqislam feels like it is one of the few casualties of the low end of the game actually being a lot fairer than it has ever been. Pieces like Dalami and Ghazi Matawiya and Coom Riders, particularly the character bikers, Zuleika Nazarova is still pretty damn good, but Zamira is back to being kind of hot trash with the change to Berserk, no longer being able to Berserk not face-to-face roll with her EMCCW. But just generally, even with the addition of Yanyans, who are a quite solid, irregular warband kind of trooper, Haqqislam historically, especially in N3 and even continuing into N4, traded on the fact that the top end of the faction was not particularly powerful, but the irregulars were fantastic. Now, Haqqislam was kept in check by the fact that you just can't take an infinite quantity of irregulars and expect your army to function in N3, especially in N4. But now, all of the irregulars seem kind of just more fair compared to all of the heavy infantry and like good quality skirmishers and drop troops. If you look at, for example, we jump to Kestrel Colonial Force and we look at the pieces that can be purchased for 40 points, 30 points, 19 points, etc. Those pieces feel equal in value relative to their points cost to stuff like Coom Riders, Zuleika Nazarova, Matawiya, etc. And Haqqislam always traded on the fact that its cheap irregulars were more efficient than their points cost would suggest, which allowed them to take other pieces that were maybe not the best for their cost, but not too bad. Now, all of the irregulars feel actually just appropriately costed, and the problems with the top end are still kind of there. You gotta deal with an awful lot of kinda okay ballistic skill 13 troopers that don't have meaningful access to link bonuses in Haqqislam. You can do some duos, but those duos are expensive. Like if I am running a Zayadan or a Muqtar duo in vanilla Haqqislam, I gotta find those points somewhere. Compared to, say, if I wanted to go into Rama Task Force, I could just duo a Zayadan with a Gulam and get all of the same benefits. It would be effectively the same gunfighting capability, and it would be like 20 points cheaper almost. So I am personally really struggling to make vanilla Haqqislam work. It's not terrible, but it genuinely feels something like a B- or a C+, if only because I personally am struggling to really make it work the way that I would like to, because how I would like it to work is how it worked in previous editions, and the game has changed. Next up is White Banner. White Banner is by no means a bad faction. I've seen at least some people rate it as a D tier, including a personal friend of mine who writes on Goonhammer. It's not. It's good, but it's not quite an A tier, or at least it doesn't feel like it. In particular, I don't know that White Banner materially differentiates itself from vanilla Yucheng. I feel like there's 1.5 really solid lists in White Banner that trade on particularly the Korean troopers and building the Korean heavy infantry into a good mixed link. But the list beyond that just doesn't do anything that feels like it's actually what you need in N5. I've had, I think, 3 or 4 games with or against White Banner at this point, and they've been eminently serviceable at best the entire time. And for that, I really don't think they warrant being rated all the way up in A tier. They feel like they're a solid B or B minus, but not terribly much better. Absolutely by no means a bad faction, but the enthusiasm that I had for them has just all been transferred to Vanilla Yuching, and yes, even to Invincible Army. Next up, we have, because Jordan is not here to stop me, Combined Army, which we rated as an S tier off the back of the appraisal of the most powerful profiles in the faction. And I think it was very easy to look at things like the Caranted Lieutenant, the Hacker Sepsator +1 order profile, and be like, oh damn, that thing does everything, and come to the conclusion that Combined Army were an S tier faction. And I don't actually think that's the case, but for a couple of reasons. Firstly, just to examine that Caranted profile in particular, it is hugely expensive and not individually good at any one thing. The most unique thing about it is the Sepsator, which is a tremendous weapon, but even then, there are internal stressors in that profile. It's 4/4 and starts in the deployment zone, and you don't want to risk it. If you want to make things happen with the Sepsator, you have to march it all the way across the field, and it does not have any particular mobility skills. If you want to hack with it, it's a fantastic hacker, but it has no killer hacking programs. It cannot Trinity, which means that the rest of your list needs to be able to actually establish InfoWar dominance in which it can then operate. If you don't do that, it will be forced to fight enemy KHDs by itself, and it is not built for that. It isn't a gunfighter either. It's ballistic skill 14, yes, and it has an X-Visor, but you don't want to be taking burst 3 shots at 0 range bands ever under any circumstances, much less with the most expensive model in your army. And so I think we overvalued that Caronted profile, not colossally, but the stresses that it puts on the rest of the list make the rest of the list have a difficult time compensating for when it's not able to perform. And that segues into the second thing about Vanilla Combined Army, which is that much like Vanilla Hackislam, you really feel the fact that the lower end of the game is more fair now. Vanilla Combined, historically, many of its most powerful lists, like the overwhelmingly powerful, people literally send me well-meaning complaints about the fact that I wrote this list style of lists, traded on the fact that the bottom end of Combined Army could be just filled with little crappers that would trade up in value. And so you would have Combined Army lists that had 1 or 2 or 3 very expensive to moderately expensive pieces, a couple of middle range things, and then just all of this crap that was nevertheless very efficient. Things like Taiga creatures, but even Garkis, right, were very solid in N3 and especially in N4. That's no longer the case. Taiga creatures are meh at best. Garkis struggle mightily under the fact that Berserk is no longer not a face-to-face role. And while Ardrones and Imatrons and Ikadrons are still great, and Dadarazi are outstanding, what it's done is it's lifted the minimum cost of the cheapest pieces in the faction up by 2 or 3 or 4 points, right? You are no longer being like, oh, I'll just fill the list out with 3 or 4 Taiga creatures. You can't do that. You want to do that, you're filling the list out with, rather than 6-point pieces or 5-point pieces, you're filling the list out with 7, 8, 9, and 14-point pieces, which means that the points you have available for the top end aren't quite there anymore, so you have to bring that down. And it overall makes the list building experience of Vanilla Combined Army much more in tension with itself, no longer able to just trivially have its cake and eat it too. I still think Combined Army is very powerful, but I think it is A+ next to Kestrel rather than S. The best lists that I have personally felt with it actually don't necessarily revolve around the aspect pieces at all, but instead are running things like Norkias, who begins the game duoed with an Overdrawn, which gives him a tin bot if you are not going first, and gives him a tactical awareness order to catapult him into the wide blue yonder if you are. I've seen some very strong lists that build around that, and then also lists that maybe use just a few more of the dangerous mid-range kind of 30-point-ish pieces, but which feel like they have to be used because almost every list has had like 10 or 12 points taken away from it because you need to pay for better stuff at the cheap end. So overall, still an excellent faction, but not a faction that just waltzes into the S tier like it did before. And then finally, Vanilla JSA, which we rated as a B. And we did that. Oh, by the way, I am aware that is the incorrect JSA logo. Humansphere.com does not have the most current JSA logo. Anyway, we rated all of the JSA factions, Vanilla JSA, Shinden Butai, and Oban, as approximately the similar around the B mark. Now, I think that was actually pretty accurate for Oban and Shinden Butai. I think we rated Oban higher. I'm personally coming to the idea that Shinden Butai might be the very slightly better of the two, but it is very close. Both Shinden Butai and Oban are good, strong factions, middle to upper end of B tier, very able to win games in the right hands and with multiple different list construction options. And while they do have limitations in both cases, they also have strengths that you can leverage to win your games. Vanilla JSA just kind of doesn't really need to exist. I would say it's probably more like a C, but more accurately, it's just not being played. There is no value proposition to Vanilla JSA. There's basically no list that you can write in Vanilla JSA that wouldn't be better suited to just being turned into either a Shinden Butai or Oban list. It doesn't have an interesting enough cross-section or access to the unique profiles from either to make the combination of the two feel really particularly meaningful, and it would honestly just really benefit of having like 3 or 4 of the spicier profiles from either of the two sectorals being added into it to give it some kind of reason for being. It is not by itself actively terrible. It's a C, it's fine, but it's just not being played, and kind of for good reason. If there is anyone out there that has found some kind of a vanilla JSA list that has a reason to exist and not just be better suited to being transitioned into one of the two sectorals, please do post in the comment section and let me know, because I'm interested to see what kind of lists that you're playing are. Overall, though, I think you'll notice if you look at these, if you were to take the tier list that we built and moderate it with these different rankings, I think you would find that, kind of like in N4, the game is clustered pretty aggressively around a solid, like, B to A spread, with a few factions in C, but even those factions in C being quite playable. And that's overall encouraging. I don't think there are any of the factions that I've spoken about in either of these last two slides that I am hugely down on, or that I think would be bad, like a bad sign to rank in any of those spots. So overall, the fact that I've got more factions that I would push up than I would pull down, and some factions that I would push up considerably, kind of just a nice thing to look back on compared to where we ranked everything. And even where we ranked everything, we were pretty optimistic about most stuff in the game. So, with the observation that I'm having a pretty good time with Infinity N5, what am I looking forward to that's coming up? Well, I don't think that there's that much that needs changing about the edition. Corvus Belli have, however, generally been pretty good at keeping reasonably active, keeping the game updated with FAQs, etc. And we know, with a little bit of an asterisk as to know, that an updated rules PDF is coming. IJW, for those of you who are familiar with him, did mention that the wiki was going to be updated once an updated rules PDF dropped, and both of those are good pieces of news. Firstly, we really need the rules wiki to be updated, and I'm very much looking forward to having all of those links in Infinity Army point toward modern and current rules, rather than having to search in the PDF whenever I'm playing. But secondly, the fact that an updated PDF is coming is like, cool, okay, interesting. There are not that many major and outstanding rules changes, that rules questions that I think people have, but there are a few, and having them potentially addressed would be solid. Plus any copy editing or anything that needs to be done. I don't know if the updated PDF will include any rules changes, but if it does, that would also be very interesting, and I'm kind of looking forward to that. Next up, I'm definitely looking forward to future faction reworks. ISS and Onyx, neither of them are necessarily in the most terrible state heading into N5. Both of them had the same designer attention as every other faction. but also both of them really could use a rework at this point. I'm particularly looking forward to the Onyx rework. I think ISS is going to come sooner based on what I've heard, but I am very much looking to the Onyx rework when it arrives. There's just so much potential in that faction. There is so much flavor. There are so many different ways the faction could potentially be built once it's had a little bit of an expansion and a Bakunin style rework. I really want to finally go and buy that extra pack and paint them up. And so, of all of the reworks that are coming, I am most excited for Onyx. I'm also excited to learn what will be coming after that. Although, at this stage, there will absolutely be content, I'm sure, that is added to the game over the course of this year and the next. I'm not absolutely gagging for new content, but I'm always interested to see what will come out. The Onyx rework, however, I'm very much looking forward to. Onyx were basically the second faction that I ever played. I went from Pan-Oceania, Neoterra, and Accondiscimento into Onyx, which was my gateway into the wider world, because from Onyx I went to Combined Army, and in Combined Army I found smoke grenades. So they are very near and dear to my heart. There are a number of them are some of the oldest models that I still own that I have painted. Really looking forward to their rework. On a personal note, I'm also hoping to make it to an out-of-state event this year, which it will have been a while since I've been to one of those. Border Bash is happening in Albury on, I think, the 7th and 8th of June, and while it's going to be a real challenge for me to get leave at that time of year from work, and the financial cost won't be that high, but might be a little bit of a struggle, I am nevertheless going to work on that. It would be very nice to go to an event, potentially embarrass myself, we'll see how I do, but just go and do an out-of-state event, particularly with the Melbourne guys, would be really, really nice. That's me, though. What about you? This is the conclusion of the video, which is why I'm prompting the audience to engage in the comment section. But generally, what are you looking forward to in the coming year? What has your appraisal of N5's first couple of months been? How are you feeling? And what's coming up that you think will be cool? Do let me know. I do read the comments, I do respond to most of them, and I'm interested to see how the community is feeling relative to my own appraisal. Now, that wraps up this video. As a quick reminder and a quick plug, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. I take requests from channel members and supporters. I can't always action all of them. Sometimes a video is impractical. Sometimes I can't, for example, set what my opponents play. But I look and I read and I take note of every request. And if I can get around to them, I do. I prioritize fulfilling channel supporter and channel member requests whenever I can. And it influences a lot of the factions that I play. If you've got something that you're interested and your channel supporter, post and I take note of it. Otherwise, as always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this. Coming up will be more battle reports and more faction focuses, continuing to aim for one video a week for the foreseeable future. As always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.